Here in Chapter 2.2, the subsection of Chapter 2, we're going to be dealing with GDP output growth. In other words, trying to measure how quickly and how much an economy is growing measured by its GDP growth, and then also taking a look at population growth and seeing what impact population growth has on the standard of living. So here's a nice factoid. If GDP grows faster than the population grows, per capita GDP rises and the standard of living rises. Now this is just a mathematical fact. Just picture in your mind, is it obvious to everybody if the total economy is growing, think of the total economy as a large pizza. So you start off with a medium-sized pizza which is 12 inches in diameter and it grows to a 16-inch pizza. Does everyone agree if all the slices are only 8 slices, so the amount of the division stays the same, if the pizza grows from 12 inches to 16 inches, every one slice is a bigger slice? That's all we're trying to say. It's obvious, or at least I hope it's obvious, that if the economy is growing and it's growing faster than the population grows, then in fact every one slice gets bigger. But going back to my analogy, let's think about a pizza. You're starting off with a 12-inch pizza, and let's assume there's only 4 friends sharing it. So we're going to slice it both horizontally and vertically into 4 individual slices. Now, we grow the pizza from a 12-inch pizza to a 16-inch pizza, but now we share it with 8 friends. So the 16-inch pizza has vertical cut, horizontal cut, and then a diagonal cut, and another diagonal cut. Is it possible that the slices, even though the pizza is a 16-inch pizza, if you divide it 8 ways, the slice will actually be smaller than the slice of the 12-inch pizza when it was only shared among 4 people? Is that obvious to everybody? Okay, that's again what we're trying to point out about growth and living standards. If the population, which is going to be the denominator, remember when we do per capita GDP, you put on the top of the formula the GDPs on the top and then divide it underneath by the size of the population. If the top number in a fraction is rising faster than the bottom number, what's happening to the total value of the fraction? It rises. But what happens when the denominator is growing faster than the numerator? Then by definition, if you're dividing by a bigger number, then the total gets smaller. So the exact same thing is true for the living standards in a country. Whatever the growth rate is, if it's greater than the population growth rate, the average income, because per capita GDP, will be rising. But no matter how fast your economy is growing, let's assume it's the fastest growth in the world, 10% per year, but your population is growing at 15% per year. So now you're going to be back in my pizza example where you've sliced up the pizza with a lot more slices, and therefore each slice, even though it's of a bigger pizza, becomes much smaller. So the same thing would be true for the income of a country. Okay, I think I beat that to death. I think we get the general idea. So where's the US in all of this? The US output, meaning GDP growth, has been roughly 3% per year. Now that doesn't sound like a whole lot, but 3% per year compounded year after year, decade after decade, century after century, the US has been growing close to 200 years. Since essentially the middle of the Industrial Revolution, it comes to the United States, and the United States is very receptive to the Industrial Revolution, and we've had this kind of growth now for 200 years. The population's been growing by about 1%. So the US has a rising per capita GDP, which means we have a rising standard of living. Now, the standard of living is only growing by about 2% per year. As I think you can recognize from the numbers, if the economy is growing by 3% per year, that doesn't mean you individually get 3% more, because you're going to have to share it with 1% more people. So you get to keep 2% of the increase. 1% of that 3% will end up going just to cover more people. So we end up having roughly a 2% increase in the real spendable income after changes in prices. So real, meaning inflation adjusted, roughly 2% per year, which again doesn't sound like very much. But in 10 years, that's 20%. That's a huge raise, isn't it? In 40 years, we're talking a huge amount, because remember, percentages don't grow linearly, they grow exponentially. So if you have 2% per year, every single year, the economy doubles roughly every 30 years. So rather, your income doubles roughly every 30 years. So I have seen, because I'm old enough, whereas you all are relatively young by my standards, I'm in my mid 60s. Since I was you all's age, in my 20s, the income that I've experienced has grown quite dramatically. And it's because we live in a very productive society with lots of economic growth. Now, some societies like China recently, ever since they gave up on full-scale communism, when they converted to a partly capitalist society, China's growth rate was quite spectacular. And China went from being one of the poorest countries in the world on a per capita basis to being, as you saw, a middle income country. Okay, and they did that all within, again, one person's lifetime. They didn't do it for quite as long as South Korea has, so that's why South Korea is up at 30,000, whereas China is just under 10,000 per person. Now, let's take a look at a graph. This graph, in order to interpret it, we have to pay a little bit of attention here to some of the details. The solid blue line right here that I've highlighted with my red dot, this is the population growth line. And you can see the population has been growing at 1% per year, and so this is where we are now. Okay? And so in 2020, our population grew from down here in 1900 up to about here by 2020, in 120 years. During that same time period, in other words, from 1900 until 2020, what did the economy do? The economy grew all the way up to here. This is an absolutely staggering amount of economic growth. I presume you all can recognize that. Now, it wasn't all straight up. As you can see, let's take a look here. You all might remember from your history classes, what happened to the United States during the 1930s? It's very famous. Why is the GDP going downhill here? That's the Great Depression. Now, that's not the only major economic setback we've ever had. You can see here in the late 1940s, transitioning out of World War II, the United States goes back into another recession, followed, of course, by economic growth afterwards. But you can see here's one, see this dip here, see this dip here, see this dip there, there's a dip there, there's a dip there. Those dips are major recessions in the U.S. economy, meaning a recession meaning that the economy is actually lowering the amount of total output of goods and services, and therefore unemployment is rising. But you can also see, thank goodness, the recession years are relatively short compared to the economic growth years, which are quite tremendous, as you can see. So the total amount of growth has been staggering. All this tan colored area in here would be the net change in the average standard of living. And that's what we see right here, nicely highlighted for us. See this arrow? This pointing out that this level of GDP is not the total amount, that's the total GDP, and then this was the amount of population. So if you divide this GDP by that population, that would be the increase in GDP per capita. Now, let's talk about poor nations. We've been talking about one of the richest nations in the world, the US. Let's talk about some poor nations. So let's go read our slide together and we'll see if it makes some sense out of this. GDP per capita are very different in rich and poor nations. We saw that on the previous slide, the 2.1 slide, when we saw how much the income per person per country varies. Everything from 60,000 in the US, and then we were in some countries it was down around 2,000 per person. Very, very different. Rich nations' populations grow slowly. Now, why is that? Generally speaking, and more than just generally, I don't think there's any good exception. Every country that's gotten rich has chosen to have fewer children. There's a bunch of reasons why that's true. I'll just toss out a couple of them. Generally speaking, countries get rich by having lots of highly productive people, and one of those groups of people are women. As women have entered the workforce, and we see that especially in rich nations, women are highly trained, as I imagine many of you all listening to this video, in fact, are young ladies working on improving your education to work in some corporation or other. as women have chosen to become highly educated and work outside the home, children, the opportunity cost of children increases dramatically. And what do we mean by opportunity cost? Well, if you are a woman who's highly educated, and let's assume that you could easily be making a salary between $70,000 and $100,000 a year, and you step out of the workforce for several years in order to have a child and raise that young child up to a point where it's going to school, how much money will you lose? Even if you don't spend a penny on the kid, which of course you will spend money on the kid, diapers and food and things like that, but even if you spent nothing on children, would there be a cost to having the child? Yes, there would be the opportunity cost of the salary that you would sacrifice by not being in the workforce. So, as women have become significantly more educated, the opportunity cost of children has gone up, and economic theory tells us when things get more expensive or get more costly, people tend to avoid them. So that's just one reason. Now, in other chapters, we'll go into more detail, but I just wanted to give you a quick example of why rich nations have such slow-growing populations. As a matter of fact, most of the wealthy nations of the world, including Japan, all of Western Europe, the United States, Canada, the native population is actually shrinking. In other words, women are having so few children, we're not even replacing parents with kids. You need about 2.1 child per woman in order for population just to stabilize, because unfortunately some of those children will die before they reach childbearing age themselves. So you need to have 2.1 children to replace the parents alone. So if you aren't having 2 children per family or per woman, then what you end up having is an actual declining population. The US has an increasing population only because of immigration. And the same thing would be true for Europe. The only net increase in population is due to immigration. So let's get back to our slide. So whatever GDP happens, we have an increasing standard of living because we have very little population growth. So any GDP growth that happens immediately goes into GDP per capita, and therefore we have increasing standards of living. Poor nations, on the other hand, have rapid population increases, and GDP in some of them may even be declining. So that would be a disaster. If you have a declining total size of the economy, in other words, go back to our pizza example, you start off with a medium-sized pizza of 12 inches and it shrinks to a personal pizza of only 9 inches, but now you increase it from 4 people sharing it to 8 people sharing it. How small does the slice get per person? It gets pretty small very quickly, doesn't it? So you can see that when you have rapid increases in population, you need to have a very rapid increase in GDP to be able to have a rising standard of living. In poor nations, that's generally not been the case. Their GDP growth has either been declining, or if it's been rising, has not been rising rapidly enough to overcome population growth. So GDP per capita, that's the income per person, is either stagnant or decreasing. Now, of course, thank goodness, that's only happening in some of the poorest nations. That's not true for most nations. For most nations, GDP is growing faster than the population, but it may only be doing so by a very, very small amount. So the growth in the standard of living might be growing slowly. But again, these are just mathematical facts. This does not say that population is a bad thing. Many people take it to mean that, and you have many people obsess over what can we do to stop population growth? Should we have more abortions? Should we have birth control plans? All that kind of stuff. That's one way of increasing GDP per capita, reduce the growth rate of the population. But of course, the other solution is increase your GDP growth rapidly enough to even overcome the larger population. So either one of those is possible. But right now, poor nations oftentimes have either stagnant, decreasing, or only slowly increasing standards of living per person. Let's take a look at some numbers on this issue, and it will show a wide variation. Nothing ever is simple. Let's take a look at the US. Here we have average growth rates. This is just for 2000 to 2018, just for those particular 8 years. Instead of having the 3% growth we've had in the past, we only had 1.7%, close to 2, but not quite. But the population's growing incredibly slowly at only 0.8%. So even though the economy is growing at a very, very low rate, per capita GDP was still increasing, even during these years when the GDP has not been growing very fast. You can see that the same thing is true here for Canada, for Japan, for France. Look at Japan. Look how low their growth rate of their economy is. Does that mean Japan is in serious trouble? No, because their population growth went to 0. So even with a very slow growing economy, if there's no more people to share it with, then all of that goes to increasing individual income by raising per capita GDP. So we see these are for wealthy countries. You can see how slow the population growth is. Middle income countries have higher growth rates on average, except for China. China is a very interesting outlier because China deliberately for decades had a very draconian one-child policy imposed by the government on families so that women could not have more than one child without going through tremendous difficulties. I mean, it was possible for a handful of people, but not very many. And China was trying to increase the average per capita GDP by dramatically reducing the growth of the population. Now, for these particular 8 years, China's had a spectacular growth rate of roughly 9.5% per year, with only a 5% increase in population. So 9% out of that 9.5% has gone into increasing standards of living. So that's why I said China went from one of the poorest countries in the world as late as 1980. We're talking a very recent time. I graduated from college in 1980. We're not talking about ancient history here. China has made major gains in a very, very short period of time, and they primarily did it after Mao Zedong died and strict communism was abolished and the market mechanism was permitted to flourish inside China, and that's where their growth came. India, you can see here, GDP growth rate's been quite good, especially compared to the United States. 6.8%, while not as good as China, is still, by world standards, a very significant increase. Population growth, of course, is higher than it is in China, but that still leaves a pretty good bit for economic growth in India. If the economy grows at 6.8, the population grows by 1.4, that leaves 5.4% of that 6.8% gets to go to increasing incomes. So India's had a relatively rapid increase in income per person. So let's see, Libya, you can see unfortunately for Libya, they've had a decline during these years. They had a decline in their economy. You might remember Libya's gone through some very, very serious bad times after the United States destroyed Gaddafi's government. There's been very, very bad governance in Libya. There's a lot of fighting, internal factions. It's very difficult for the Libyans to prosper. And so they've had a declining economy and a growing population. That leads to, as you can see, a double whammy that the average income per person has declined pretty significantly per year in Libya. Now let's look at some really low income countries. Let's take a look at, let's just use Haiti and Ethiopia. Haiti has a very low growth rate of their economy. They have not a super high growth rate of the population, but a pretty significant growth in the population, and that leaves them with declining by 0.1% per year in income per person. Look at Burundi. Burundi has a growth rate of their economy more than twice the speed of Haiti's growth. But unfortunately, they also match it with a very rapidly growing population. So, as we see, the two things completely offset each other. There's been zero growth in the living standard of people in Burundi. They should be growing quite dramatically, but because there's such a large population growth, then you're going to get no growth in the per capita GDP. And here in Ethiopia, they've had a growth rate for these 10 years, quite dramatic, very close to where China is. They've got a pretty rapidly growing population, but as you can see, with a growth rate this high of the economy, the per capita is able to grow pretty significantly. So my point is, you can't make a blanket statement about all these countries. It's quite varying in both their growth rate of their economy that we measure here in the first column and the growth rate in their population, leaving us quite wide variations in the growth of per capita GDP. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about is the mix of output. The transformation of the United States into a service economy reflects our increased income and relative affluence. That's what the slide says. What does that mean? I presume everyone recognizes that the U.S. is becoming more and more of a service economy. Many people believe that the manufacturing side of the United States is declining. That's not true. Total production of goods and services is rising in the United States, but the service economy is rising even faster. So as a percentage, we see that the service economy is growing and the manufacturing part of the economy is shrinking. Again, shrinking relative to the service economy, not shrinking in total size, because manufacturing is actually growing. It's just growing slower than services are. Why is that happening? Let's refer to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This is from psychology. You all might recognize this from one of your other classes, but Professor Maslow is quite famous for this particular theory. The Maslow hierarchy of needs says that when people are poor, they concentrate quite a bit on simply getting food, clothing, and shelter. And they don't worry too much about higher things that they would like to have. Because when you're hungry and you're cold and you're wet, the only thing you're thinking about is physical survival, and you put most of your effort into those things. Now, of course, the wealthier you become, you start thinking about other things as well. Like, wouldn't it be nice to have education? Wouldn't it be nice to have entertainment? Wouldn't it be nice to have all kinds of things like that? Things that you would not have put a whole lot of effort into when you were poor. The richer you get, the more you put effort into those things. It turns out that most services are relatively for luxury-oriented services, getting your house cleaned is obviously a luxury as opposed to doing it yourself. We recognize that service is a luxury. Being able to get your teeth worked on by a dentist regularly. I mean, in a poor country, you may never see a dentist in your entire life. And when you have a rotten tooth, someone has to pull it out with a pair of pliers. Now, of course, the wealthier you get, the more you'll spend on dental care. Health care in general, you'll spend significantly more on. You'll spend significantly more on education. And of course, you all as students should recognize that immediately. If you're going to a private university like Mercer, you are obviously not poor. Well, at least it would be very rare. Occasionally, a poor student through brilliance and getting scholarships and loans could be coming to a private university like Mercer. But most students who do come from that, their families are relatively well off. And they see the advantage of education, and therefore they're willing to spend the money on it because they have the money. So we tend to see that. The wealthier a country gets, the more emphasis it places on things like education and other service-oriented things. And of course, once you already have 3 TV sets in your house, buying a 4th one just really isn't that valuable to you. You'd much rather spend the money on a service like, I don't know, take a cruise on a cruise ship, or in the case we keep flogging, get more education. There's other things you'd rather spend the money on than having more physical items, because when you're wealthy, you already have a whole bunch of physical items. Whereas in poor countries, in our last point here, in poorer countries, resources must be devoted to producing food and goods, not services. So we see the service sector in poor countries tends to be relatively smaller, and the service sector in rich countries tends to be larger. You will find that most likely when you go to look for a job, you will be looking for a job in the service sector, or even if you get a job at a manufacturer, you will be in one of their service-oriented areas, like taking care of customers, providing all kinds of service activities to your customer. Most likely you will not be literally, well, I wouldn't expect you to be actually physically building the item, nor will you be actually directly supervising workers who physically produce things. Most likely you'll be working on marketing plans, dealing with financial issues, financing of products, those kinds of things which are much, much more service oriented.